everybody, and welcome to this week's lecture from chapters 2 and 3 of our textbook for persuasive writing. For those of you who have not met before, my name is Wendy Falk and I'm your instructor for this course. Tonight I want to say thank you to my coworkers here at Carl Traeger Elementary School for loaning me the use of the camera and of the classroom space. So this evening, this lecture that I'm about to go through is the same PowerPoint that you have available to you on Blackboard under week 2. I'll make sure that that is posted for you, but it should be saved as a chapter 2 and 3 lecture PowerPoint. Okay, that's what you're looking for. Chapter 2 deals with the context of the material that we are writing, and there are in order to argue effectively, one must consider the context or the environment in which the argument is happening. And there are multiple factors to consider, as you can see. In the case of your textbook, they identify 3 major contexts that it is wise for a writer to consider when they are writing a piece. Those 3 major contexts are rhetorical, cultural, and historical. Okay, and then you can see your textbook also gives you this diagram, things that we should consider when we are actually writing an argumentative piece. So something we have to consider is audience. That's a large part of what relates to rhetorical. You have to consider your own thoughts and opinions on the subject, and of course the subject itself and what you happen to know about it, or what you can prove really. Rhetorical complex, let's start there. Or context, excuse me. Rhetorical context implies mostly the consideration of a writer's audience in identifying the most persuasive arguments. In other words, you are going to change your argument based on who you are speaking with. How I might talk to my second grade students who use this classroom is very different compared to how I'm talking to you. How I might have a discussion with the parents that I work with is different than if I were sitting here talking maybe with, President Obama. I am going to change what my argument sounds like and the words and the tone that I use based on the person that I am speaking to or writing for. Okay? So the audience is defined as the person or the group for whom we are writing. In this case, for example, you are my audience. I have created this PowerPoint and I am preparing this lecture for you. I am talking and writing in a way that I think will best fit you. Okay, so realize that that's what we do. Even when we're simply talking to someone, we innately find a way to shape our message for the audience. Some things that you have to be able to think about your audience include, for example, you're going to have to draw on your knowledge of the audience in order to create an effective argument. You have to avoid stereotypes or overgeneralization. Sometimes people will be talking to a group and they'll say, well, all of you people. That sounds like a really arbitrary phrase, you people, except for the fact that it sort of alludes to an overgeneralization. If someone said, all women think, or all men act like, we're starting to get into a territory where we're overgeneralizing and in danger of stereotyping, and those almost always backfire. So it's really wise to be careful about those things. Your knowledge of your audience is limited. I know you as my students, but that doesn't mean that I know everything about you. I don't know your families. I don't know your jobs. I don't know everything else there is about you. You know me as your instructor, but that doesn't mean that you know everything about me. So even though you can communicate with your audience, there is a lot you're going to have to guess about your audience in order to be able to write effectively. So we can make some educated guesses, but in the end, we have to write in a way that we feel will convey our opinion solidly, back it up with evidence, but in the end, you're trying to make a guess based on what you know. So that's rhetorical context, and that you're really thinking about the audience there. Now we're talking about cultural context. Your textbook defines culture as the set of experiences, knowledge, beliefs, and background as influenced by your race or ethnicity, your region, the area in which you live, your religion, your social class, and your gender. In other words, Everything that you live and breathe and experience on a daily basis is what makes up your culture. There's no one thing that is culture or isn't culture. It's everything about the life that you experience on a daily basis. That pretty much is what makes up your culture. Because it's very, very complex, individuals of various cultures will have a variety of reactions to your writing. So if I'm writing for teachers and this is the culture that we work in, and then I go down to Milwaukee and I talk to public school teachers down there, guess what? Different culture. Inner city Milwaukee compared to Oshkosh, which has a population of about 65, 70,000, that is a very different culture. It's not, and I'm not just talking about race or ethnicity. I'm talking about social class and religions and race and culture and gender and all of that mixed together. Okay, it's going to be very different. My brother's a police officer. There is a specific culture to being a police officer. It's not, people outside the world of police work don't completely understand what that's all about. It's very different to live a life where you're constantly putting your life on the line to protect people on a daily basis versus, say, working in a hospital. Both jobs are equally valid, but those jobs imply two different cultures for those occupations. So just realize culture can mean so many things, but based on who you're talking to and their cultural context, they're going to bring a different meaning to what you're writing. Culture also affects how people engage in an argument. An example of this might be for someone from another culture, say, from another country entirely. That person might come up to you and you ask them a question or kind of put them on the spot, and maybe they'll just say yes or back off. Because in their culture, it's rude to actually take on a person's argument. So you have to realize when you are arguing with someone, take into consideration not only your culture, but their culture. Consider where they're coming from and realize that how they engage is not less valid, it's just going to be different, and we have to be able to be flexible and roll with that. Regardless of the group, we make general assumptions and we adjust accordingly. Again, the rule here is be flexible. Historical context refers to understanding when we make an argument and how to take that moment into an account when we're constructing an argument. The same appeals are persuasive at one time but not at another. For example, why is the gun control debate so effective right now? 2 words, Newtown, Connecticut. Because of that terrible tragedy in Newtown, people are taking a whole new thought process onto themselves in order to address the gun control debate. People are looking at it in a whole new way. They always thought that that debate was an important one, but there's a new sense of immediacy and importance about it now that that tragedy happened, and other tragedies have happened since then. So think about that. It's a historical context. What did people automatically go back to when Newtown happened? Their minds first went back to Columbine. Okay, so we do think historically, and we think about the connections that we're making. And in order for people to make this argument very important now in this time frame, they refer back to other historical context events. So it's really important to take the historical context under advisement as you're writing as well. Okay. So again, just to review, Chapter 2 was all about context, especially you're thinking about the rhetorical context, thinking about your audience, you're thinking about the cultural context, and you're thinking about the historical context. All the different things we have to think about when we are preparing to write. Chapter 3 is all about the media's ability to persuade you, okay? Why would we want to study that? Well, one of the reasons is because we can use it as a model for our own understanding of how to persuade others, but we also want to understand it because we want to be good consumers. It's good to know when the media is manipulating you, and it's good to know when you're actually able to make an informed judgment. So that's part of being a good consumer, is knowing the media's ability to influence you. They talked in this chapter a lot about the different forms that media comes in, and I'm going to touch on some of those more than others. For example, media in print. This is the most traditional format for formal argumentation. You know, the opinion columns in newspapers are probably one of the most classic examples of opinion writing or persuasive writing that we have. But we have to consider the audience of the publication. Those people who write the New York Times or read the New York Times might be a different crowd than those who read USA Today. Again, equally valid publications, but they serve different audiences. Okay, so when you're writing for one of those, you have to take into account what it is or who it is you're writing for. Going back to chapter 3 or chapter 2. Writers tailor the strategies to fit their audience. How I'm going to talk to one audience might be different than another one. Again, going back to chapter 2. Visual media. Photography is extremely powerful. Everyone knows a picture is worth 1,000 words. Sometimes a picture is worth more than that. When I think back to 9/11 and the images of those twin towers up in flames, the airplanes hitting those towers, there is not a single American of my generation who won't remember that, or even younger generations who won't remember that. We have those pictures in our head. That visual media is very compelling. So we have to consider its meaning now versus historically. Those pictures mattered something back on 9/11. Do they still mean something now? Yes, they do. Most people would still find them very persuasive and very powerful. Does the meaning change along with its ability to persuade? In today's day and age, if it's a huge historical event like 9/11, then those images typically can continue to persuade for generations to come. If it's something that is no longer of as great an importance to us, then the image loses its ability to persuade as strongly as it had before, unless a person has a personal connection to that historical event. Advertisements are hugely powerful, and they're great at combining persuasive language along with persuasive imagery. They use design elements, including color, arrangement of the text and the imagery, to persuade the consumer. You can actually go to a marketing agency and they have huge amounts of statistics to tell you what colors sell best. And if I place the words this way, I can see it. For example, the way a person reads an advertisement is in a Z pattern format. So we're going to read across the top, and then your eyes drag down to the left, and we read across again. If you ever look at an advertisement in a magazine, that's exactly the eye pattern you'll notice your eyes following, okay? And they know that, so they're going to use their color and the way they arrange the text and the imagery to follow that Z pattern format, or even to break you from that Z pattern format so that they can catch your attention. But this is all the stuff that they take into consideration when they are attempting to persuade you using an advertisement. Art sometimes is used as propaganda. If you think back to the war bonds posters and things from the 1940s when we were in World War II, those posters weren't just posters. They were artwork that was meant to forward a cause, and in so doing they were able to elevate artwork to a persuasive message, and certainly that still happens today. Today's format, we see things more like editorial cartoons. And then of course the internet can be highly persuasive, but I'm going to caution you about the internet, because the biggest problem with the internet is people often don't know how to disseminate fact from fiction on the internet. What's real and what's not? What should we believe and what can't we believe? What sites are legitimate and what sites might not be safe for the kind of information we're looking for? Which brings me to this next topic, credibility. This was an issue that was addressed in our textbook, and I think it's a really important one, especially when you are thinking about credibility of an internet source. To discern credibility, we have to consider the source. What does the media source have to gain from publishing this message? Okay, so most newspapers, any newspaper wants to make money. I mean, that's just honest. They are businessmen and women, but most newspapers are also in it to educate, to inform, and yes, to persuade. Okay, so but the goal of the New York Times is very different from the National Enquirer. The National Enquirer seeks to publicize and entertain and their goal is entirely about making money and has very little to do with informing readers and persuading readers regarding important issues, okay? So it's more about salacious gossip. It's yellow journalism at its finest. So you have to consider the source. If I read in the New York Times, for example, that, I don't know, JFK had been having an affair with Marilyn Monroe, which is considered kind of old hat news. If I were to read that in the New York Times, that would mean something different to me than if I saw it on the front pages of the National Enquirer. Okay, so if you consider the source between those two publications, that's kind of what I mean when I talk about credibility. You know, if you were going to come to me and say, well, Wendy, you know, I'm looking for information about autism. Am I a credible source? Yes, because I am a parent of children with autism. But if you were to go to, say, you know, a random person on the street and they were to start spouting facts, maybe they know something about autism, maybe they do, and maybe they don't. And how do you know? You're going on a wing and a prayer. And sometimes people take information off the internet the same way. So it's really important to understand more about the actual source you're using. That's why I care a lot about your sources when you share them with me. This is going to be what my paper's about, for example. You really need to be careful about the sources that you're using. And also consider for credibility, how does that affect my life? You know, if the information is wrong, for example, does it affect me personally? If it does, it really is important that you take that information seriously. Another way to take, how does this affect my life personally? In other words, if I give you information, what do I have to gain from it? So if I give you false information about autism, what am I gaining from that? The National Enquirer, they get paid regardless of whether the information they print is true or not. Okay? So they get paid and they have something to gain out of that. They are able to affect their livelihood. And that's what we need to think about. Also, when researching, we need to review multiple sources to discern reliable facts. What's real, what's true. I had a student once who was doing research on Martin Luther King, was really excited about the paper, and he went to martinlutherking.com, and he thought this was going to be a fabulous paper. And then he came to me a few hours later. He said, Mrs. Falk, I'm really concerned because he doesn't sound like the kind of guy I hoped he would be. And I'm like, wow, you don't often hear that about Martin Luther King. Let's take a look at this website. With just a few clicks, I was able to discern that the website was actually a front for the KKK. They were looking for a way to catch people. They knew people would look up Martin Luther King, and then they used that as an opportunity to defame his image and his name and any deeds he had done without completely revealing themselves. You had to do some work to find out that this was a reliable source. So, you know, you have to be really, really careful. And all I can tell you is we're going to talk more about this in class this coming week when we talk about which sources to use. But I invite you, please, when you are doing research, to use reasonable educational databases for your searches. If you just do a Google search, you're on a wing and a prayer there. But there are some great educational databases that will link you into bajillions of just tons of great educational resources and journals and things that are completely reliable and totally open for you to use on this kind of assignment. Okay, and that brings us to the end of our discussion for week 2. This was chapters 2 and 3 of the textbook. If you have any questions, I invite you to please post those under the questions prompt on the discussion board for week 2, or feel free to please bring those questions to class. And I look forward to seeing you in either place. Thank you.